Let's get this straight from the beginning, I wasn't in the thick of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Name's Thomas LaForge, though some knew me as Horse Rider. I rode as a scout with the 6th Infantry, under the Army's command. But when June 24, 1876 rolled around, I was laid up with sickness and had to be pulled from the field. So, no, I didn't see Custer's last stand with my own eyes. But I came upon the field not long after it all ended, when the blood was still drying, and the echoes of gunfire hadn't quite faded. I listened to the men who had made it through, when their voices still shook and the memories hadn't grown cold. And I walked the ground where it all happened. The land felt wrong when I got there. Quiet, yes, but not calm. It was like the prairie itself was stunned. There was no wind that day, no birdsong, just a low, heavy hush. You could still smell the burnt powder in the air. The soil had been torn up by hoofbeats, boot prints, and worse. The bodies had been cleared, but the story was still written in the dirt. The weight of what happened there was something you could feel in your chest, like a hammer resting on your heart. You see, history has a habit of focusing on the big names, on Custer, on Sitting Bull, but the truth of it lies in the margins, in what the scouts and soldiers saw, in what they carried back in silence. Some of those Crow scouts who rode with us, brave men in their own right, spoke quietly of what they'd heard and seen. And then, some years later, I stood on that same field, side by side with an old Sioux warrior who'd come back to walk the ground himself. He didn't brag. He didn't curse. He just spoke. He told me about a man named Mitch Bouyer. Now Bouyer wasn't just another scout. He was part French, part Sioux, a man of two worlds. He rode with Custer, helped guide the 7th Cavalry, and knew the risks better than most. They trusted him, even if they didn't always say it out loud. The Sioux warrior told me he saw Bouyer get shot during the battle, hit in the back, somewhere close to the Little Bighorn River. Said the shot shattered his spine. Didn't kill him outright, just left him there in the dust, struggling to breathe. The fight surged around him, then moved on. When the dust settled and the killing was done, they found him still alive. Not moving, but aware. The Sioux man said Bouyer looked him square in the eye and spoke. Told him, in so many words, you may have won today, but this won't last. There are thousands more soldiers out there, and they'll come. You can't stop them all. Then Bouyer asked to be finished. Said the pain was too much and he wasn't about to wait for it to get worse. The Sioux obliged him. Shot him, stripped his body of its vest, a calfskin one, spotted, and threw him into the river. No ceremony. No marker. Just the end. A few days later, I came across that vest. It was lying near the water's edge, stiff and sunbaked. There weren't many like it, calfskin with spots. I knew right then it had belonged to Bouyer. His body wasn't there. Might have floated off downstream. Might have sunk. But that vest, that was the story. A piece of him still holding on. Now, there's been talk over the years. Some say Bouyer was killed during the first charge, maybe fell off his horse at Medicine Tail Coulee. Others say he was seen trying to crawl out of the river, blood in his mouth. Both stories might be true. He could have taken a bullet early, tried to get out, then ended up stranded near the riverbank. War's messy that way. The truth isn't always a clean line. I also heard from one of the men who helped bury the dead. Said the body they found closest to the river was Henry Voss, the bugler. That might have been the same patch of ground. Bouyer could have been nearby, and the water just took him where we couldn't follow. That vest was the last clue. I don't share this story because it's neat or noble. I share it because it happened. Because if someone doesn't speak the names, then the stories die a second death. And Bouyer deserves to be remembered, not just as a scout, but as a man who saw the truth of what was coming, even with his last breath. Back then, we didn't call it trauma. We just packed up and moved on. But something about that battlefield stuck with me. I wasn't even there for the bloodletting, but I felt the weight of it just standing in that silence. It was like carrying someone else's shadow. The Sioux warrior who told me Bouyer's last words, he didn't seem proud of what he'd done. He seemed tired. Worn thin by time. Maybe we all end up like that. When you're young, it's all about the fight. But when you get older, you think about the things you can't fix, about the men who didn't come back, and the ones who did but never really left the battlefield. There's something about a battlefield that holds on to grief. It soaks it up and keeps it under the soil. And when the wind is just right, it breathes it back out. I still see that vest sometimes, in my mind. Still see it lying there like a question without an answer. You won't find Bouyer's name carved into any big stone monument. But he stood and fell with Custer. He rode into hell with open eyes. That counts for something. And if there's a marker to be made, maybe it's in the stories we tell, the ones with rough edges, told around fires or over fences, where truth lives longer than polished plaques. Bouyer's death wasn't pretty. It wasn't glorious. But it was real. And in the end, maybe that's all that matters. So I keep telling it. Not for me. For the ones who can't. What's odd is how memories don't just age, they shift. They turn over like stones, showing new sides the longer you carry them. Every few years, I'd find myself back near that river. Never on purpose. My boots would just end up heading that way. Maybe I was trying to piece it all together, or maybe I just needed to make sure it hadn't all disappeared into the grass. I remember the sound of wagon wheels crunching along the dry trail as the burial parties moved through. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. But the air itself felt different there, like it knew. Some places carry memory better than others. The Little Bighorn holds on tight. Even now, I sometimes wonder if Bouyer knew what he was walking into that day. Scouts are good at reading the land, reading people. He must have known. And he went anyway. That's the part that gets me. He didn't run. Didn't make excuses. He just rode alongside the others, into something he likely knew he wouldn't walk back from. And the others? Most of them didn't leave behind stories. They didn't get the chance. Their names got lost in lists and reports. But men like Bouyer, those who stood at the edge and still walked forward, those are the names I hang on to. Not because they were heroes in the way stories like to pretend, but because they stayed. And because they mattered. If you're ever out that way, near the banks where the Little Bighorn cuts through the hills, stop for a moment. Listen. The wind might be quiet, but it's still telling the old stories. Stories of a scout with a calfskin vest, a river that kept its secrets, and a war that still echoes if you're paying attention. I still am. And there's another detail worth mentioning, one I learned decades later from a letter exchanged between veterans at the National Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C., where I spent my final years. Old soldiers like me gathered there, swapping memories over coffee and canes. One afternoon, I read a letter from a man named George Glenn, a member of the cavalry burial detail. He wrote that the body nearest to the river's edge had distinctive characteristics. Besides a spotted calfskin vest, the man wore a bugler's sash and a battered bugle hung by its strap. The bugler, Henry Voss, and Bouyer must have perished close to one another. Together, they symbolized both defiance and the tragic randomness of war. It struck me how intertwined those final moments were, two men, one a scout, one a bugler, each playing their part in a doomed charge, each swept aside by something larger than themselves. Voss's bugle never sounded the retreat, Bouyer's voice never echoed another warning. And yet, their gear lingered on the banks, silent relics of men who'd ridden to the edge of history and fallen beyond recall. For years, I carried that image with me, the vest, the bugle, the silent river. Whenever a youth asked what the West was really like, I'd tell them this story, hoping they heard more than just adventure. It's not a story of glory, I'd say. It's a story of choices, and consequences. They'd nod, eyes wide, then go chase dime novels about gunfighters. That's how it goes. But let me close with this: war isn't a single moment of valor. It's a string of moments, some filled with courage, others with agony. And for every great leader on a horse, there are dozens of riders, scouts, messengers, and buglers whose names fade into the dirt. They deserve more than dusty archives, they deserve to be remembered by voice and by story. So next time you stand by a river, listen for the hush, the weight in the air, and think of a man named Bouyer, clad in calfskin, who spoke of future battles even as his life slipped away. Think of Henry Voss, his bugle silent. Think of a scout named LaForge, bent with age, still pausing at the water's edge, listening, remembering, and carrying those stories so they won't fade into the grass. That's why I tell it. Not because I need it to be remembered for me, but because they deserve to be remembered for themselves. And if telling it brings even one man to pause and consider what really happened, then Bouyer's vest, Voss's sash, and the river's hush have all done their work at last.